So I want to explore moving from closed captioning and the focus on augmenting the audio portion of media to looking now more broadly at accessibility more generally or more broadly. This idea of using one sense to augment another sense is an interesting perspective or paradigm to approach media. What are your thoughts on accessibility sort of more broadly and the way that different senses play a role in opening up media to all audiences?
Yeah, it's so interesting when I've been in this field for a long time, and though involved with every possible kind of technology to make it accessible, I'm always coming back to media and senses. And when I was contacted by you folks at the Internet of Senses, I really began thinking of, well, what am I really doing? Am I making media accessible, or am I somehow transforming media from one sense to another? And because I'm a huge fan of Oliver Sacks and the work he did on synesthesia, people who see colors and taste images, I thought, oh, maybe my job is really as a person who manufactures synesthesia. And that really triggered all kinds of thoughts. But of course, taking images and turning them into audio, taking audio, turning it into text, what about the other senses? I've started creating this grid, this outline of 5 by 5 senses. Of course, many people argue there's a lot more than five, but this notion of, all right, what other ways do you turn one sound into another, or sound into haptics, into touch, which there are some interesting technologies around that. How do you use virtual reality for a blind person? I recently tried out the Apple Vision Pro and, of course, told all my friends in the accessibility community about some of the amazing imagery, which, by the way, Apple built in descriptions for the blind into the images. But they said, but I'm a blind person. Is there any reason I really would want this? And I think that's a great conversation to have. And how do you navigate a virtual world that is full of these alternate senses? And then how should we involve smell and taste in transforming a song into something you taste? I don't have the answer to that one. I'm hoping someone who listens to this podcast does. But certainly haptics is very big around both people who have vision loss and hearing loss.
Yeah, absolutely. Within our in our touch podcast, we have a whole many conversations around haptics, and that's such an interesting technology that does blur that line between sound and touch. And so I agree. There's other places I think where we can blur the lines between senses and find whether it's a technology or a process that allows us to manufacture synesthesia, as you put it. As somebody who works in immersive media and virtual reality, I see virtual reality as a great place to explore these different ways of augmenting senses in media. Have you done much work in that space, or have you used 3R as a tool?
Yeah. When the latest round of excitement around VR came out, and it's been a periodic experience, but when it really, even before Facebook became Meta, when we realized this is going to become part of our mainstream world, I put together a consortium that has now become something called XR Access, which you can find information about at xraccess.org, now housed at Cornell Tech in New York. And we gathered a bunch of people together and say, what are we going to do? This cannot be released into the mainstream as a completely inaccessible technology. And one of the first things clearly was, okay, captions. Where do you put captions in this 360-degree environment? That's the virtual reality, the augmented reality, like, Google Glass had captions hanging out in front of your face when it first came out. We had a great conversation among a working group from the World Wide Web Consortium on simple questions like, where should these captions appear? And this notion of, should they be headlocked? So when you look forward, the captions are right in front of you. When you turn your head, they travel with you. Can you relocate them? What if they're in your way? Can you move them out of the way? The Vision Pro actually jumps around as you turn your head. The captions move into that field of vision. that wasn't a done deal. We didn't really know what would be the best. And the sort of obvious answer became, well, why don't you let the user decide? Why don't you just make it under user control? Who I prefer it lower left. I prefer it behind me. I prefer it way up in the sky. Shouldn't be so hard. So that's where some of the early prototypes came out. Where do we put captions? And then how do you generate them? If it's something pre-produced, what if it's live? What if you are in a simulated environment with other people and they're speaking? Can you create automatic live captions there? How do you indicate who's speaking? Walk into a party, a virtual party. What if two people are speaking on the other side of the room and they're having a private conversation? Should you make a way of turning off the captions because they don't really want to be overheard? We created this concept of the cone of silence where you could isolate a couple of people who say, we're having a private conversation here. Please don't generate captions. These kind of ideas were so interesting to track down. And some of them have actually started getting embedded into the latest VR technologies.
Mhm. It reminds me when you were talking about, the positioning of captions, there's a couple of Russian films, Day Watch and Night Watch, and their captioning actually is attached to the characters. As the characters move around the scene, the captioning is right next to the characters, which is, when you think about normal captioning, being, in that lower third of the screen, you don't think about being able to quickly differentiate which character is speaking other than there's titling on that. And so now that we're moving into these ideas of real-time spatial captioning, can we start exploring that, attaching it to people using color, using other kinds of representation on that to help people understand where is that coming from.
Yeah.
And then of course that issue of privacy is, a very important one, especially as we move into tools that can do it on the fly, real time in digital environments.
There was
um,
a great development at the University of Barcelona where, okay, you're in a 360 environment. Someone may be talking behind you. First of all, yeah, assigning colors definitely helps, or maybe even a little avatar, a little icon that shows the person. And they created a little compass. So that could appear in the lower corner of the screen, and you might see words in front of you, but you don't know where they're coming from. And the compass would point you to the left or to the right or behind you and say, if you turn around, you'll see the person who's talking. It's like, wow, that was a really interesting innovation.
Absolutely. And like many innovations, I think when we hear about it, it seems so simple.
Mm.
But when we're trying to address that problem, those things don't immediately pop out to us. And I mean, I guess that's why a novel innovation is difficult, is that it in hindsight, everything seems obvious. But when you're staring it in the face, it's a real challenge. Um,